I'm David Clayton, and this is the Way of Beauty podcast, conversations on Catholic faith and culture.
This is episode 44 of the Way of Beauty podcast. I'm here with Fr Jeffrey Kirby, who is a priest of the Diocese of Charlston, North Carolina. And notice I had to hesitate there as someone who's from a different country. I make sure I got the right Carolina. So it's great to have you here, Father. Now, Fr Jeffrey is an author of a number of books, including two with Pontifex University Press. But we're here today to talk about his latest book, published through Ave Maria, and which is available through Amazon, called Be Not Troubled, a 6-day personal retreat with Father Jean-Pierre DeCaussade. I probably butchered the pronunciation.
Oh,
Father, first, could you just tell us the story of this book? It's an intriguing title, and what you hope people will gain from reading this.
Yeah, so this book really came from kind of a whole movement just in terms of my own approach to homiletics and to teaching and preaching, because it's more and more what I'd see among Christian believers. People would leave the church and say there's no spiritual depth. They would get involved in Buddhism or various Eastern philosophies, or they fall into the New Age, and they do this sincerely believing that the church has nothing in terms of spiritual treasury to offer. And passionately, I just keep this, seeing this increase. And I thought, we do have a vast treasury. I mean, Pope St. John Paul II said where the Buddhist tradition ends, the Carmelite, and I would say by extension, the Christian tradition picks up. There's a lot there. Now, part of this movement, I think, is the fault of leadership, because as I even looked at my own priesthood, I thought, well, how often do I reference the spiritual masters in my preaching or in my teaching? How often have I sought to introduce the Christian faithful to this great part of our patrimony? And had to realize I wasn't doing it myself. But I started looking for spiritual masters that I could use in terms of teaching and preaching, and drew a lot of these great writers in terms of their wisdom and so on. But one that stood out among all these different ones that I was using, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, St. Louis de Montfort, and the list goes on. The treasury of the church, the spiritual treasury, is vast and beautiful and diverse. But I kept going back to Jean-Pierre DeCaussade, his writings, because he wrote about 250 years ago, right after all the religious wars, when the West, and especially France, was getting its bearings again. And he gave a series of lectures to some visitation nuns. He never expected this to be a book. These were meant as retreat conferences. The sisters were so inspired by his writings that they saved all these notes for 100 years and eventually put it into a book. Well, the interesting thing about DeCaussade's writings was 250 years ago, he retrieved some really trailblazing truths from our tradition. For example, the universal call to holiness. Every Christian has a vocation, not simply a particular group. The understanding of God's permissive will in suffering or evil. The role of redemptive suffering in the Christian way of life. The opportunity to grow in holiness even in the midst of regular duties, from washing the laundry to doing dishes and so on. So all these DeCaussade retrieved, and he has this book that was put together, again, about 100 years after this retreat he gave. And it was put together under the title, Abandonment to Divine Providence. Well, here's the thing. The first time I read it as an undergraduate at Franciscan University of Steubenville, I thought, what is this? I have no idea what this guy's talking about. Because it's steeped, his book is steeped in French scholasticism, a heavy philosophical language in places. He can be redundant because, remember, this was being given as a retreat. And I just thought, okay, I'm not sure if this guy has anything to offer me. Well, after kind of life beat the stuffing out of me, right, a little older, I went back to DeCaussade and realized there's a lot here that I have grown to appreciate. And as I have found DeCaussade to be a spiritual mentor and spiritual friend in this push to promote our spiritual patrimony in the church, I, of course, went to DeCaussade among many others, but I thought that DeCaussade especially could be very useful to us today. So I took his writings in order to prevent my initial experience with him, among others. I took his wisdom and I broke it down into 6 days. It models the 6 chapters of the book and made his wisdom digestible in a retreat format so that anyone could pick up this little book, Be Not Troubled, which was one of his big things, abandoned to divine providence, and hopefully be able to drink, as we would say, from the wellspring of spiritual wisdom, especially from DeCaussade.
Wow, this is exciting. And the whole field is so close to my heart. I live here in the East Bay near San Francisco, and what always strikes me about this area is that people are looking for mysticism. They're aware of this call for us to be a mystic, and this is not a sort of an unusual thing. As you're saying, every person is yearning for this, and which means that it can't be something that you have to do by spending 50 years on a mountaintop in Tibet to achieve. There have to be very practical ways to doing this for most people. And I think that something like this would have huge appeal if we can package it right and sell it right to people here. And I'm guessing, and so I'm going to put this to you, I'm guessing that the first readership you're imagining here is Catholic, that you're talking to Catholics, you're not attempting to hide this, but the goal then really is for us to do what is contained within it, be mystics ourselves, and then be contagious,
Yes.
try and attract others. And that's the next step for each of us, really.
Yes. And if we just look at, for example, echoing some of the points you're making, David, that if we look at Amazon, the #1 genre is selling on Amazon is transcendence and spirituality. So there's definitely a cultural yearning for transcendence, for spirituality, for a depth of soul that is beyond the mere material.
Yeah.
And so beyond the material, and I think it's interesting that with Be Not Troubled, the first review for the book on Amazon was actually from a non-Catholic, right? And they actually said, I'm not, the priest probably wrote it for Catholics, but I got so much out of this book. And really the book can be for Catholics, for Christians, by extension, to people of goodwill, who again are just looking for that's something that is beyond the material, beyond our calculations, beyond our maneuvers and so on. So I hope that Be Not Troubled can not only help direct people in that way, but also show people, remind the West of the incredible treasury that we have in the Christian tradition. I mean, as I really thought about it, because of this cultural challenge, I myself was just surprised, thought, why have I never preached about the purgative way or the illuminative way, or, about the understanding of, the spiritual darkness that comes, with aspects of the spiritual life, or the different prayer forms, composition of place, or, Pustinia and the Russian tradition, and various things of that sort. It's so rich. And really, in many respects, as we deepen in our relationship with Christ, so essential in terms of spiritual growth, and yet it seems almost universally ignored.
It's as you're speaking, I was just thinking that I'm involved now in trying to see if there's a way in which we can create the equivalent of what you get around here, a meditation center. So we're trying to package this to local people, but really it shouldn't need that we have the Christian spirituality centers. It's every parish. That's what it should be. People should feel that this is available. It is not something that's beyond what is normally offered within the Christian faith. And so I think it's wonderful that you're doing this. And maybe so this is not something for individuals to do, but something that could be taken up at a parish level and be part of their evangelizing process, as well as stimulating and nurturing the faith of those within the parish and deepening it.
Yeah, and I'm glad to hear you say that, David, because I'll tell you one thing that I have also noticed. I mean, I was doing this, and I completely understand, and I don't think there's any fault, but there was this heavy push, and I think there still is a heavy push when it comes to evangelization to immediately go to catechetics, and it's understandable. Like we want to declare the truths of faith and so on, but I just wonder if in the West today, the best way of approaching is through the spiritual patrimony. So by introducing our spiritual masters, by introducing spiritual wisdom to help people encounter God and then say, yeah, I'd like to know more about him. It's almost like Paul in Athens, he walks around, he realizes there's this empty altar, and he tells the Athenians, I see that there's this altar to the unknown God. Well, I know him, right? And begins to preach about living and being in Christ and the seasons, are reflections of his glory and so on. So I just think in that way, there's more that we can use the spiritual patrimony for in terms of introducing the truths of faith than what we maybe in the past have thought. Because it's almost like the idea is, well, we give them doctrine, then they move into the sacraments, and then the sacraments, flow into the spirit, into a moral life. And then as part of the moral life, one develops a life of prayer. And that's the classical catechetical process. And I just wonder if we have to reverse that right now, because people aren't going to listen to us describe dogma or doctrine, but they'll listen when we talk about how to pray.
Well, I think so. And I think the evidence is there by the success of Buddhism, for example. That's exactly how they do it. So I agree with you. So why don't we get a little bit into the detail then of, you've got this 6-day structure. Obviously you can't lead us through the retreat now, but if you could just give us an overview. And the question, before we even get into the content, is this something that I need to take 6 days off work for, or how will that work practically?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because where it says 6 day, it can be deceptive, because actually in the intro I mentioned multiple various ways someone can do it. So first, as you were mentioning earlier, a person can do it by himself or herself. A family can do it. A parish group can do it. And then in terms of the chronology, certainly someone could take the book and say, I'm just going to take a day of silence, or I'm going to take a weekend, and the book would be a great companion for that. Truth be told, most of us couldn't do that, or if we do that, we have to plan for it far in advance. So instead, the book is also designed where it can be 6 days. So one thing I recommend is starting it on Monday, finishing it on Saturday, and then place it all before the Lord at Sunday worship. So it kind of, the liturgy becomes the summit and the source of this. So start on Monday and 6 days at home, after work, or maybe at lunch, or wherever a person can cut out, some time. And that could be a 10-minute session. It could be a 30-minute session, depending on where a person is in their spiritual life or how deep they want to go with this. But it can also be done once a week for 6 weeks. So maybe for example, someone does a holy hour every Thursday, or they have a prayer group on Tuesday mornings and so on. So it can be done 6 weeks, or it can even be done on a specific day for 6 months. So First Friday, this becomes the First Friday devotion, or during adoration or something, right? Yeah. So the book is attempted to be as versatile and fluid as possible, so that anyone can pick it up. The chapters are not very long. They start with an opening prayer. They give some initial thoughts. They then give a little bit of explanation from DeCaussade, applying it to contemporary examples. I use examples from my own life in order to illustrate how important these can be in the trenches. And then it concludes with another prayer and with some possible action items, how to take this wisdom and now apply it to our lives where we are. So each chapter, again, it could be 10 minutes, it could be a half hour, it can be an hour long for a prayer group or something. So my real focus was, this has got to get out, and how can we make this as flexible and applicable as possible in as many situations as possible? Because David, it distresses me as a Christian and as a priest, to see people abandon biblical faith. I mean, to abandon Christian discipleship because they legitimately believe that the church has nothing to offer. And we have this vast treasury. And I think we've taken that lit candle and we've put it under the table. And this book was one small effort to put the candle back on the table so they can shine and give light to all.
Right. Could you just give me an example then of, just so I can imagine what these, is it spiritual exercises, or is it a meditation or a contemplation? Just furnish us with an example of what we might be doing on day 2, for example.
Yes. So DeCaussade, and again, some of it is in the original work. DeCaussade can be repetitive because they were given as retreat talks, but he basically walks us through is understanding the present moment. That God is everywhere. So he even jokes at one point. He says that Our Lady was probably annoyed when Gabriel appeared to her, because for Our Lady, God was as present to her doing the laundry as in the presence of an archangel. That every moment becomes this sacrament. DeCaussade coins the term the sacrament of the present moment. This invisible, this visible moment of invisible grace. He also develops this really beautiful spirituality of the I am, where he says, God is not in the past, he's not in the future. So he says he's not in past hurts, he's not in future hopes. God is here, and the best place we can find God is right here, right now. So the first couple of chapters develops that notion, because obviously that can startle us a little bit in the West, because it immediately challenges us in terms of this frenzied pace, this multitasking, right? Go, do 2 things at once. Go, the more you can do, the better, and the better you can juggle things, the more successful you'll be, and go. I mean, people sitting at dinner with a friend on their phone, doing their to-do list and worried about social media all at the same time. And not really experience the moment, that sacrament of the present moment. So DeCaussade works very difficultly in the first few chapters to kind of break that, that kind of crust. Certainly in his day, and even more so, I think, in ours, which is why I think it's so helpful to us. And then he goes on to talk about vocation. He talks about, especially the role of virtue. I really like what he does with virtue. He says that virtue is holiness in tangible form. So virtue is, sometimes we can have these very almost abstract notions of holiness. He says, no, holiness is, smiling at our neighbor when we don't want to. Holiness is going to the extra mile for the neighbor, next to us, and so on. So he says, and that's holiness right there. Like that is constant emphasis on the present moment, doing this now. And then he says, by having that understanding, God's presence, this role of virtue, we can then fully abandon ourselves to God's providence, that God is here. He has a plan. We can trust that plan. He doesn't say we're to be quietists or pacifists. He says, no, fulfill your duties. He has a very strong notion of vocation. Fulfill your duties. Have genuine concern over your responsibilities, but then when it's done, abandon yourself to divine providence.
Sorry, I was muted. I had a conversation yesterday, and I'm going to throw this to you to comment on. I think it's connected with what you're saying. I'd be interested in what you think. There was a discussion about whether there are such things as coincidences. And I said, I've never been one to look for signs of God in coincidence. I think things occur at the same time, but the people I was with thought I was saying, I don't see God in what's around me. And actually, I was trying to say the opposite. I was saying that if you only see God in these sort of what might seem to be unusual signs, yes, then I think we're missing the fact that everything is a sign. The whole of the cosmos is there to point us to God.
Yes.
And these things only seem remarkable when we're not sensitized to the fact that everything is part of God's plan.
Yes, and I'll tell you what's so important, and DeCaussade would be right there in a sense of seeing the whole narrative as the unfolding in the present moment of God's will, and calling us to that act of trust and confidence in him. And what is so important in that view that you've described, DeCaussade, of course, would say the same thing, is that that is a very important perspective, especially when there is suffering or hardship. Because we think, well, God is only here in these coincidences or these moments of particular blessing or grace or consolation or material blessing even, right? If we think that that's it, well, wait a minute. Well, God is as present to us, perhaps even more, when there is suffering and tragedy and hardship and disappointment and so on. And so I think that while it's not intended, a lot of our spirituality today, if we're not careful, is heavily influenced by an evangelical notion of health and wealth gospel. That if you do this right, you're going to be blessed. God's present. There's no coincidence because God wants to bless you. God wants to give you what you want. God wants to, and that's true, but incomplete, because there are times where God will say, I need you to suffer for me. I need you to carry this cross. I need the righteous to suffer for the sake of the unrighteous. I mean, this is the core of our faith. And if we limit God, as you're saying, David, if we limit God to these coincidences, then we miss his presence in all the other moments. Right? So
yes, and so miracles is the same sort of thing. I believe in miracles, but they're only remarkable in that the mechanism by which the event is expressed is not to the common order, if I can put it like that. Yes. But everything is a sign of the working of God. It's the same sort of thing, and it's interesting to hear you say that, because I've had amazing things happen in my life since I became Catholic, but I think the most remarkable is the appreciation of the unremarkable.
Yes,
that's what's the great change.
Yes. Yeah, and to see God in the ordinary, absolutely. To see God, and this is a strong push of DeCaussade as well, to see God in the ordinary. He would even say mundane things. The fact that 2 + 2 will always equal 4 should fill us with tremendous wonder. Like the fact that we can do laundry and it becomes a means of our eternal redemption. This is powerful, beautiful things that we should never allow ourselves to become accustomed to or take for granted. So I think that sense of awe is constantly provoked when we realize, well, yes, there are particular miracles, but life itself is a miracle, and all the moments of life are God revealing himself in different ways and different circumstances. That includes even hardship. Like DeCaussade is very important in his teachings on the permissive will of God in terms of evil. Right? That in all things that God doesn't actively will evil, but the realization, the call to accept the fact that he will permit evil. Why? St. Paul talks about in the letter to the Thessalonians the mystery of iniquity. But DeCaussade goes further, and DeCaussade says, look, we take this at face value. Like God allows this in order that the suffering will serve a greater good. So maybe my suffering is so that a missionary's preaching can be more effective in terms of conversion to the Christian faith. Or maybe my suffering is happening so that there's brought about reconciliation in my family or the family across the street or something. So for DeCaussade, every moment was a powerful opportunity, a sacrament to encounter God. And I think the more we retrieve that, the more we'll want to put our cell phones down.
Father, we're back again. I think we had the internet was down for a second there. But you're talking about the role in this of suffering, that it has a part to play in our holiness, and the more that we experience this through God's grace, the more we can actually see some meaning in it, and it can encourage us to embrace it in a new way in the ordinary things of life. So you're talking about spending time with our neighbor, for example, as a result of this, and not fleeing it.
Yes, and I think that's again a very helpful retrieval that DeCaussade gives us. This in this whole realization of the commonplace of suffering in our lives. Like we can, if we're not careful, we can kind of try to create it's an artificial world where suffering doesn't exist or shouldn't be there, or if we suffer, something must be wrong, like we've done something wrong, or God has somehow failed us or something. And DeCaussade really puts suffering back within the context of divine providence. Like the Lord blesses us with prosperity, the Lord blesses us with suffering, and so on. And very much whatever God may permit, DeCaussade would invite us to accept that as a part of the plan, a part of God's providence. And I just think that continuity is so important because, again, oftentimes we can think, well, no, God's here when things are going great and wonderful and I get what I want. But then suddenly there's hardship or disappointment, and, well, where did God go? It's like, well, God is there too, and to see that also as an opportunity to encounter God.
And when we do, there is a consolation that I'm going to suggest. I'm asking you to comment on this if it's wrong, but that there is a consolation that transcends that suffering. That's the amazing thing about the Christian faith, that it doesn't take away necessarily the bad thing. We might still have to put up with that, but it gives us a way to be happy. There's a sort of inner consolation that is greater than the suffering we're experiencing, and sits alongside it in some way. And we can't imagine that, or certainly I'm just speaking from my own situation, that's even possible, because I know that that's not how I am naturally, but it's only when I've had to face those things, and thank goodness on those occasions when I've reached for God, I prayed, and that I think I can get through this, 1 minute at a time or something. Mm-hmm. And there is an inner peace, and it's a mystery. But it is possible. I think of Saint Stephen, the martyr, and I hope I never have to face that. But in the little events of my day, they're important to me, the things I have to deal with.
Yes. And to take, for example, the situation with Stephen, of course, the first martyr, he's stoned to death. And what do we see right after that? Well, because he accepted, repeating the Lord's own words, I commend my spirit. Right after that, what happens is he is seen, to approach the throne of God. And the only time throughout all of the scriptures that Christ is shown standing at the right hand, not seated, standing. We can say the Lord Jesus gave Stephen a standing ovation, right? And then right after that, Paul converts. And there's a strong spiritual tradition that says it was the suffering of Stephen that brought about the conversion of Paul. So we see in this that evil, there's no Pollyanna here. Evil is evil. But precisely because it is evil, when we take it and offer it to God, we abandon it to divine providence, and God can bring a good out of that evil by our openness to abandon ourselves to divine providence. So, there, in one sense, evil can betray itself when it's presented to the person who's willing to offer it up for a greater good.
Right. Well, I think we'll finish there, Father. Is there anything you want to say in closing? If not, perhaps just tell us where we can buy it and where we can get hold of it.
Yeah, thank you. I'd say the whole point of the book was to help people understand the spiritual depth of the church and to understand God's presence in our everyday lives. And the book can be purchased from Ave Maria Press, the publisher, or through Amazon or any Catholic bookstore near listeners.
Father Jeffrey Kirby, thank you very much indeed. Fascinating conversation.
You've been listening to the Way of Beauty podcast, conversations on Catholic faith and culture. If you enjoyed this episode, then please give us a 5-star review on iTunes. This will help others to find it too. Also, if you're interested in delving more deeply into the material that we discuss, you can do a course at the Pontifex University website. That's pontifex.university.